Does RAW matter? We're going to look at it from a practical example. I'm Scott from photography Banzai. So I have three different cameras with RAW plus JPEG. The first one, the M100. Also have the P1000 from Nikon, that big super zoom I looked at recently. And also my phone, I use the Open Camera application. It's open source. It gives you the D&G RAWs. Go through three different photos from each camera. So first off, we've got 100% crop with the Canon software. We've got the RAW on the one side and JPEG. I really don't see much of a difference in this specific case. That's just 100% crop, so you could see the details. I'm not really seeing much of a difference. In this case, very similar. There are maybe some slight differences in detail here and there, but I'm not really seeing a big difference. That's again with Canon software. In this case, there is a little bit of difference with the Canon software exported to the TIFF file and then opened up in Photoshop compared to the standard JPEG. Maybe slightly different colors, but noise and such is very similar. So we're using the ACDC software at this point. It's doing a lot less processing, but still very similar with this 100% crop on that same photo. Here is the full version. So in this case, when I resize to 960 pixels for each one, basically that gives you an idea of if you're pushing to Instagram, Facebook, whatever website where you don't have super large resolution, get an idea to see if they are similar enough that you don't really need to care, except for extreme situations of messed up exposure or whatever. So in this case, the RAW actually has more color fringing that wasn't corrected when all the processing that I did, which was nothing. In that case, it just exported through the ACDC software. Now it does have a lot of options, but in that RAW state there will be optical issues that you can correct depending on your software. In the RAW exported from ACDC, right in the center, you can see this little leaf here, or whatever it is. It's actually a piece of grass, I guess, but definitely has more detail to it. In the JPEG, you're losing quite a bit. So you can see actually a difference in exposure in this case, which is pretty interesting, but again, you could easily correct or adjust the RAW to make it look like the JPEG. Basically, you can see a lot of color noise. So in this case, it really depends on how good your software is. Because I didn't apply any noise reduction in this case, I could definitely improve that situation if I were to adjust the RAW file. So we look at the compacted version of that file. They're actually very similar. There is more color noise you can still see in the RAW version, but it's not bad. So in this case, I would probably use either one if I wanted to just put some web version out there. Now let's look at the P1000. In this case, it's a 100% view of one photo from the camera shop. Don't really see much of a difference in this specific case at 100%. There is a little bit more color fringing on the RAW version. Of course, I'm not correcting any of that stuff. You can see more color noise, but details are actually relatively similar. The issue with JPEGs when the processing is not perfect is that you'll get this watercolory look, which we're going to see a lot of with the P1000 and JPEG mode. So I really like having that option to do RAW with a camera like that has a small sensor, because you can really decide if you want a certain level of noise reduction. You can avoid, or at least potentially avoid, a lot more of that issue with the watercolor look to the photos. But of course that's at 100%. So when we look at the full compacted version, not really any difference that you can notice. Another 100% view of the P1000. Definitely more color noise on one side, but then on the other side you lose a huge amount of detail. It's just pretty much wiped out in some areas, but actually in the oranges I do see a slight difference in shade on the JPEG side, which is good. So here's the compacted version. Pretty similar, but I do prefer the colors from the RAW version, and of course that's before processing. It's just more vivid. But with the JPEG, you can see even when it's compacted like this, it's got that watercolory, blotchy look to the photo, especially with the Sony logo area right above there. Definitely not great. Here's a 100% view on another P1000 photo. In this case, you've really got that watercolor look to the edges of the JPEG. I think that looks really bad. And you've even got some JPEG noise, where basically when it's compressing the JPEG file, it gets this weird pattern look to it. Now you can potentially remove some of that if you're trying to process a JPEG, but you don't have that issue with the raw file. But of course, then you've got more color noise and other issues like that, but it's something you can potentially correct. So here's the compacted version of that one. They are pretty similar, just looking at the screen as it is, 960 pixels. There are differences, especially a little bit more detail, I think, on the raw side when you compress that file, but not a huge difference. So now we're to the LG Stylo 3 phone with that open camera application that does the DNG RAWs. In this case, you can see there's a very dark area. This is a pretty big difference of exposure, or at least what you can see in the photo. That tree area is fully visible on the raw side, but on the JPEG side it's super dark. The colors are different, just a lot of difference. Now the text on the JPEG is actually more legible, but you could easily process the raw to improve that situation. So here's another one with the shadows boosted in Photoshop to that JPEG file. You can see that it actually lost a lot of information from that tree area, which is pretty serious in this case. I think it's a big benefit of RAW for this specific use, because you are losing a lot of information on that side. So here's the compacted version of the previous photo. You can see that it is relatively similar, but there's a big difference in color. You've got more of a purplish hue, which I prefer for the moment, but you could easily adjust that to a more neutral look, similar to the JPEG. Here's another one with the LG Stylo 3. You can see a pretty big difference at 100% with the textured area right in the center. There's a lot of compression artifacts and other issues with the JPEG file compared to the RAW. Of course, the RAW again has more color noise, but that's something you can potentially correct without causing all of those problems. In this case, I increased the exposure 2 stops in AC/DC itself through the RAW editor, so we can get a true example of what's possible with the JPEG versus the RAW. You can see this area, especially by the left side, is a lot better in the RAW photo compared to the JPEG. There's just blotchy mess, kind of lots of blocks of color, and it just looks terrible. But with the RAW, again, it has the color noise, but it still has some detail to it, which is good. So here's the photo compressed down to small view. In this case, probably not a huge difference. There's some slight coloration differences. That's more green, I think, but basically pretty similar. So this one here is shot at a higher ISO. That's the highest ISO I took at that specific outing with the phone, but you can see a pretty large difference. The colors are different. There's a lot more blotchiness to the JPEG. Even the texturing, you can see on the edges of that little stick coming out that it's pretty blotchy and weird looking on the JPEG file. Somewhat similar when you compress it down. So even at that higher ISO, if you don't care about larger sizes, then JPEG's probably alright. That was a quick practical look at a few photos from different cameras with the RAW and the JPEG files. I think in the case of smaller sensors, having the option for RAW is really important, and it gives you a lot more ability to get the best possible out of that small sensor. But the funny thing is that a lot of smaller cameras don't give you that option. So maybe in the future, camera companies will get the idea that RAW really needs to be in a lot of cameras, be in every camera, to give photographers the best possible results they can get when they want to spend more time. Of course, you can adjust things in the camera to potentially improve the JPEG processing. Some cameras are better than others, but I personally prefer to shoot RAW most of the time. Now I will do the RAW plus JPEG, especially in cases like this, but even so, I tend to not use JPEG that much because I don't really care about the size of RAWs. Processing can sometimes be an issue, especially with new cameras. Even with the M50, the CR3 format is barely supported. Adobe Capture One now, and a few other programs maybe. And of course, Canon's official software, but there are definitely positives to each side. If you don't really care about a little bit more processing time, a little bit more battery use with the RAW plus JPEG, I'd say go for that. But otherwise, I think RAW is always a good option when you can do that. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Scott from Photography Banzai. If you did enjoy the video, please consider subscribing. That helps me out a lot. Likes and shares help out a lot as well. Thanks again.